Hello. So today I'll be basically presenting on my recently completed PhD research. So my background is in cognitive science of religion and in social anthropology, and I know many of you are historians here. So the perspective may be somewhat different, and forgive me if it's not as richly nuanced as some historical work is. But basically my topic of interest was the growing rejection of Catholicism in the Republic of Ireland, both in terms of the signature beliefs, in terms of identification with, in terms of practice, and how this may or may not relate to the moral contamination of the church, which has occurred over the last few decades. It's a link that's often made, but it's often not examined in very substantive detail, so I hope to kind of address that. So basically how I'll run through this is I'll give you a bit of background for the research first, which will just be a kind of extremely blunt and basic overview of Irish secularization. And I know all the terms that I'll be using are contested, like religion and secularization and all the rest, but I'm not going to bore you by running through those particular arguments up here. I'm just going to use problematic terms and keep going. So I'll basically show you the background of the study. Then I'll show you two different kind of pieces of research I did while doing my PhD. One is a representative survey of baptized Irish Catholics, and the other is fieldwork, which I undertook in two Dublin parishes and online and among devoted secularist and religious groups in order to try and flesh out the things that I found in my survey. Okay, so without further ado, I'll talk briefly about Irish secularization. So there was a point in time where the Republic of Ireland was considered a kind of pious outlier in Western Europe. Some would argue that it still is. This kind of situation was detailed to some extent by Tom Inglis in his book Moral Monopoly, where he kind of describes how for a long time to be a good Irish person and to be a good Catholic were considered the same thing. He talked about a thing called the Irish Catholic habitus, whereby every day you'd sort of project behavioural signals that, yes, I'm a Catholic, I'm a trustworthy and good individual. And Inglis sort of described the unravelling of this culture and how it came to be replaced by a kind of situation where ostensibly and visibly being Catholic ceased to be as important a component in being Irish as they had once been. So today, Ireland is often a kind of poster boy for swift and surprising secularization. Here's a Financial Times headline asking the question, has Ireland lost its faith in the church? And it seems like it's rather belated. That just came out this year. So although Ireland can still look relatively pious, the Republic, by the way, when I say Ireland, I refer to the Republic out of habit because that's where I'm from. I don't mean to offend or cause any problems. So from the 1990s onwards, especially, practice starts to decrease and the church loses social and moral influence. It has been losing it for decades before that, but this process seems to accelerate somewhat. And in the 2000s, we see the emergence of Irish nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, to a greater degree. There seems to be an acceleration in people severing their ties to the church. Now, this is a hugely causally determined, overdetermined process. So you have, for example, long-standing kind of moral issues that were always divisive and problematic that have kind of bubbled to the surface. You have new media. I mean, Inglis, for example, places an enormous amount of emphasis on television. Now we have the internet, other things beaming in kind of new perspectives and ways of looking at the world. So EU membership, maybe new kind of global movements might have had a small impact. The declining role of the Irish mother as a domestic enforcer of piety is hypothesized to have had a strong effect by some. And obviously you have the Celtic tiger as well. I mean, it's not completely deterministic, but cross-culturally it seems that growing affluence tends to correlate with a reduction in religious belief and identification. Practice too. But then hanging over this is always also the spectre of clerical abuse. This is often kind of portrayed as a sort of coup de grace, which really and finally put paid to the church's influence and had a kind of accelerating effect on the decline of Catholicism in the Republic. The current consensus in sociology, at least as far as my reading seems to reveal, is well represented by this quote by O'Fake and O'Connell. And they say that high levels of belief and identification as a religious person, coupled with decreases in attendance and confidence in the Catholic Church, indicate that for Catholics in Ireland, religion is becoming private and personal. So they are very much channeling the British sociologist Grace Davey, whose view of believing without belonging is that belief in God, and often, theologically recognizable, for example, Protestant or Catholic belief in God continues while practice and behavior kind of atrophies, and a sort of privatized, more personalized religiosity takes over, but maintains itself because belief is important for people. So you have a kind of pious model, pious variant. Another variant of this kind of links to the idea of fuzzy fidelity, what the British sociologist Voas refers to as fuzzy fidelity, which is the idea that out of a sort of type of inertia almost, people will go on identifying with a religious tradition, claiming religious beliefs, but this is something that kind of atrophies over time, that as kind of the normativity of secularity takes over, we see this waning. And some places it never disappears, like in Denmark, for example, where, there are very high rates of skepticism about religious beliefs, but people aren't really very exercised or excited about them either. Everyone remains a member of the Lutheran Church, while about 50% of them are also atheists. So you have these two different models, sort of Mary McAleese style pious variant. The other fuzzy variant is kind of talked about by the economist David McWilliams in his recent book and on the Late Late Show. And of course, it's not that one is true and the other is false. There are many people who are like Mary McAleese, and there are many people who are like David McWilliams. And I wouldn't want to say either of these theories is incorrect. What I would say is that there's a kind of slight tacit assumption evident in the literature that this is a new kind of homeostasis. This sort of disengaged, deinstitutionalized Catholicism is the way things are now in Ireland. And it's often described as a fairly conflict-free kind of situation. There are reasons, I think, to question both of these positions. The problem for the privatized variant is drawn very much, for me, from my studies in the cognitive anthropology of religion. This work tends to suggest that the transmission of religious beliefs and the social identities connected to them tends to happen most effectively when there are obvious examples in the social environment of people behaving as if they actually do believe in the things they say they believe, and the identities to which they cleave are actually important parts of their lives. So this creates a problem for the notion of privatized belief, at least being a kind of intergenerationally transmissible, stable kind of thing. If you have kind of mental representations of God and religion and being Catholic that don't seem to have any great outward manifestation, that just remain private, internalized things, and they aren't acted upon, that would presumably have a deleterious effect on making the next generation likely to adopt those same things. On the other side, kind of inertial, fuzzy fidelity, there are a number of problems with that as well, and that's mostly the idea of kind of comfortable harmony that it seems to entail. So it makes me wonder how kind of durable is it? So, for example, in 2008, ESS data on 14 Western European nations, it was found that Ireland, the Republic of, was the most religious of those countries. It had the highest approval of religion of the 14 Western European societies. That shouldn't be understood to mean the highest approval of institutionalized religiosity, but it had the highest approval of religion understood more generally. It had the smallest minority of non-believers and atheists, but at the same time, those atheists were the most overtly anti-religious of the Western European atheists. And this follows a pattern that we see quite widely. For example, atheists in the United States tend to be a lot more vociferous and moralized about their atheism than atheists in Scandinavia, where religion isn't seen to pose a threat to secularist ambitions in the same way. So there's that. And then there's the fact that the non-religious are the fastest growing group in the Republic at the moment. And other work seems to suggest that Ireland is notable for the number of convinced atheists that it has. It has the 7th highest proportion of convinced atheists in the world, apparently, and it's growing fastest next to Vietnam. So it seems that rather than a perspective of sort of comfortable homeostasis, that it looks like there's more conflict out there. So the questions I sort of came to were that existing sociological interpretations of Irish Catholicism are perhaps quite static, they're quite harmonious, they're quite conflict-free. As an anthropologist, it seems to me that society is often riven with moral conflicts and that this isn't well represented in existing literature. Another one was how transmissible privatized or cultural religion really is in the absence of any kind of embodied displays indicating that it's even of any great kind of importance to the people who claim to hold it. What about growing non-religion in ex-Catholicism? How does this play into this notion of a kind of comfortable cultural Catholic default? And how might clerical abuse factor into this, if indeed it does at all? So the first stage of addressing this was basically a survey that I circulated. It was nationally representative for socioeconomic status, age, gender, urban, rural habitation. It was small for a nationally representative survey, but they're expensive to run, and I was a PhD student, and you can figure that one out. So it was conducted online as well via the Qualtrics panel recruitment service. And I'm not claiming this is the be-all or end-all or this kind of makes up for or rivals large established sort of quantitative data like you find in the census or the ESS. But I did ask different questions and they seem to produce different results, which I think are interesting. So by way of analysing between group differences, and this is a very crude split because of the small sample, I relied on it for most of my analyses. I split the sample into Catholics, privatized Catholics, and ex-Catholics. So I defined them as follows. Catholics were people who rejected neither church teachings nor a Catholic identity. Privatized Catholics rejected church teachings but not a Catholic identity. And ex-Catholics, which were a surprisingly large amount of the sample, rejected both church teachings and a Catholic identity. And right off the bat, we can see that age is a pretty significant predictor of this. So here we have the Catholics on the left, and the age branches. It tends to be older people who identify, or who ended up in this particular group. Though this 45 to 54 age bracket, there was a really unusual spike in religiosity, and I'm not really sure why that was. I'd be interested in any kind of theories about that. And the privatized tend to fall in the middle, and the ex-Catholics overwhelmingly age was a strong predictor of ex-Catholicism. If you're younger, you're more likely to be an ex-Catholic. They're also more morally progressive. That is, they tend to espouse liberal moral values more than conservative ones. I don't think that's going to blow anyone's mind here. And their level of domestic religious exposure was much lower, and they were more atheistic. As for the question of just how atheistic they are, okay, well, these are two scales I gave them in the course of the survey, so it's a bit small and it's difficult to see. This one measured their degree of confidence in various kind of signature Catholic beliefs. So they've essentially flatlined. They totally reject, for example, transubstantiation or belief in the powers of the saints or a number of other kind of symbolic Catholic beliefs. the privatized kind of float more towards the middle. If I ask them more generally on their certainty of God's existence or non-existence, they tend to be quite atheistic as well, this ex-Catholic group. I mean, there is variation. So, I mean, if you're not familiar with a box and line plot, that's the mean there. And this is 25% above and below, and that's the 25% again. So there's some variation, but they tend towards not believing in God, despite our frequent work kind of advocating this idea of privatized belief being the new norm. So they outright reject Catholic beliefs. Unspecified theism seems linked to the retention of a Catholic identity. So a lot of the people in this privatized group, they were unsure about Catholic beliefs, but they tended to believe in God. There's no statistical significant difference between these two groups. So that sort of seems linked to the retention of a Catholic identity, sort of one's own private theism. But I kind of wondered whether this did indeed represent a new default, or whether it was a transient or perhaps even kind of troubled compromise. And one thing that could lie behind this is a decline in what's called credibility enhancing displays, which are behaviours that suggest your models do indeed believe what it is they say they believe. So here on the bottom we have scores on their Catholic belief scale. Here we have the degree to which they perceive their parents to be motivated by religion in their daily behaviour. And the more they perceive their parents to be motivated by religion, the more religious they were themselves, basically. And you have a kind of blank spot in the bottom here. That's to say that people who whose parents were in no way visibly motivated by religion almost never seem to end up Catholic believers. So yeah, I did a multiple regression on that, and the credibility enhancing displays was the most significant predictor, followed by moral progressivism, followed by age. Gender was significant as well. Urban-rural habitation didn't seem to be, which I was surprised by. Could have been in a bigger sample, it would have been. So yeah, that was the most significant predictor, how religious your parents behaved. And there was a very similar story for not just religious beliefs, but also social identification with Catholicism, the degree to which you identify as a Catholic and the degree to which being Catholic is an important part of your identity. They were extremely highly intercorrelated, which suggests that if you have orthodox beliefs, it's important for you to go on being a Catholic. But if your beliefs are not orthodox, being Catholic is not very important for you, which seems to suggest that the idea of a kind of onward, stable, personalized and privatized Catholicism, which is very popular in the sociology of Irish Catholicism, may not have as much behind it as we think it does. Okay, another thing that could also be seen to contribute to this is what I would call cred depletion, which is, so the basic perspective offered by Inglis in Moral Monopoly is that orthodox doctrinal devout Catholicism has kind of waned and faded and been replaced by this privatized version. And this can be analogized to a decline of credibility enhancing displays, such that people may still be religious of a certain generation, but they're not expressing it very much anymore, and it's not catching on to the next generation. So if we look at the credibility enhancing displays by age bracket, you can see that the older people who are, the pointer doesn't work on the screen, I never considered that. The older people perceive their parents to be more motivated by religion than the younger people. So this sort of drops off. So it can be interpreted as a decline in creds. Each generation perceives its parents. It's not longitudinal data, but it's the best that I have. Each generation seems to perceive its parents to have been less influenced in their behaviour by Catholicism than the generation before. But then what's interesting is this kind of process has been linked to the emergence of what's sometimes called apatheism, which is just a total lack of interest in religion and religious matters, in Scandinavia, for example. But that's not what we find in Ireland. And I'm rocketing through this. I'm afraid I'll be, there'll be more time for questions then. So that takes me then to the moral dimension of ex-Catholicism, which is quite pronounced. For example, I asked the participants whether they considered the church to be a positive, negative, or neutral influence on Irish society. And on the left, you can see the Catholics. Good is the biggest one, but it's outweighed by neutral and bad together. In the middle, the privatized, they have they kind of bad is the strongest association they have with that. And then the ex-Catholics, though, very, very much strong consensus around the idea that the church has been a bad influence on Irish society. This kind of bespeaks some sort of strong, underlying, unifying moral worldview, I think. Something very catchy and convincing. Another way you can look at the moral contamination of the church and the moral dimension of ex-Catholicism is by investigating to what degree ex-Catholics trust Catholic religious specialists. So it's been noted that trust in Catholic clergy has declined. So I wanted to get an idea of how much this is and how much it relates to no longer wanting to consider yourself a Catholic at all. So what I did was I gave them a list of 10 kind of commonly encountered social roles, like shopkeeper, teacher, builder, banker, politician, criminal, atheist, priest, and bishop, and asked them to rank these in order of trustworthiness. Cross-cultural data sets seem to suggest that atheists are a particularly distrusted category. This was originally found in the United States, and it's no great surprise there, but it's been found elsewhere as well. What I found was that in sample overall, priests and atheists were equally trusted. They both came around the middle, and bishops were trusted less than atheists. But when you break it down by the groups, you find that it really does depend on the group. So here again we have our Catholics, and this is priests. So they trust priests pretty well. They're fairly close to position number one. The privatized don't trust priests very much. But again, not too bad. The ex-Catholics don't trust priests at all. They were just above bankers, politicians, and criminals in trustworthiness. But it gets worse, though. It gets worse for bishops. Bishops for the ex-Catholics are actually less trusted than bankers and politicians, but they are more trusted than criminals. So, I mean, this sort of suggests that it's really a hierarchy that people are particularly suspicious of, perhaps. But then the issue is, this gives us a kind of reading of how much they're trusted and how much the institution in general is disapproved of by ex-Catholics, but it doesn't really give us an idea of why. So before I gave them any questions in the survey, I gave them a thing called a free list. And this is a kind of old cognitive anthropological technique from the 1960s, where basically you give people a term, like, for example, Irish Catholic Church, and you ask them just to freely just list all the associations that come to mind with the Irish Catholic Church as they occur to them. And then what you do is you find, you get this measure called Smith's S, or salience, which you get basically from the amount of times a term appears in different lists, multiplied by how close to the top of the list it tends to be. So I collected these free lists and then got some research assistants to code them so that they were sufficiently homogeneous that they could be compared with each other. I have no idea how long that glass of water down there has been there, but I'm going to start drinking it at some point.
Fresh.
It's fresh? Great. Okay. I'm not going to come away with E. coli or something then from this. All right. So if we look at the Catholic group, the swiftest association they had with the term Irish Catholic Church was clergy. That was the most salient association. Then there was Mass, then there was sacraments and rites of passage, then there was communion, churches, buildings, Pope. God finally gets a look in at number 7. We get abuse and paedophilia at number 8, but swiftly we're back to Jesus then at number 9, and confession at number 10. The privatized provided a more mixed kind of a list. Clergy was the most salient association, followed by sacraments and Mass, communion. Then we have kind of moral judgments starting to emerge, like corruption and materialism, abuse and paedophilia, conservatism, authoritarianism, then back to familiar religious associations. Then the ex-Catholics had an extremely negative list. The most salient association for ex-Catholics with the Catholic Church is abuse and paedophilia. Corruption and materialism and conservatism and authoritarianism follow that quite quickly. The education system presented itself in this list as well, and I mean, as you probably know, that's a current point of secular religious tension in the South. Then dishonesty was prominent there as well. So, I mean, we can kind of clump these together and say that rejection seems, now I'm not making causal claims here, the correlational, it seems linked to moral conservatism, and they don't like the kind of morality that the church is seen to stand for. And it's also linked to kind of fundamentally immoral conduct on the part of representatives of the church as far as they're concerned. I can't make any kind of direct causal claim. Obviously, there are a whole lot of factors to do with the ex-Catholic group that also kind of determine this kind of thing. For example, as background factors like their exposure to credibility enhancing displays. They're a different age. They're more progressive anyway. I mean, I don't think this kind of suggests shocked withdrawal, where ex-Catholics were all devout Catholics and then for some reason they're more sensitive towards paedophilia or something and they will stop being Catholics. No, there are other underlying factors as well. But another question sort of presents itself, and that is, you know, one can reject the church and remain a nominal Catholic or a deinstitutionalized Catholic or even an atheistic Catholic. One doesn't have to reject the whole thing completely. So what lies behind the further step of outright disaffiliation? And this is something I looked at more in the field. So I did my field work in Dublin. Just to explain the image, it's from Cork, not Dublin. So sorry, I just wanted to make sure you didn't think I was cheating you. I did my field work. Well, I tried to enter every bun fight that was going, really. So I did participant observation in a conservative Catholic church that says the Latin Mass. I did participant observation in liberal Catholic splinter groups. I did it in secularist groups. I did it in pubs where I could talk to ordinary people and get their opinions. And I did it online as well, because particularly with secularist groups and people who are in favour of dampening the influence of the Catholic Church, the internet's a very important place for them to get together and talk. So I kind of interviewed about 28 people, talked to dozens and dozens of them, and looked at a lot of kind of rhetoric and dialogue online as well, and in publications, content analysed that. To return to this, when I was in the field, the QUB affair kind of exploded. So that gave me a kind of look at what happens when scandal is activated. It's kind of I noticed before that happened, a common occurrence I found was the belief that scandal had kind of played its role and depleted confidence in the church, but that it was something that was kind of now done and we're moving on. QUB seemed to question that a bit for me. Without wishing to stand up here in front of you all and talk about herpes simplex, my impression is that scandal is more like something that is constantly there and has sort of outbreaks. When it's in the environment, it has an outbreak and it enters into the social world and it's batted back and forth, and then it dies down away a bit until the next one comes along and it explodes out again. So this was a ritual conducted by some quite zealous ex-Catholics in Cork around the time of QUB. They dressed in black gear and carried a black cross, and the leader wore a nun's habit and carried a chalice of blood, and they were honked at by motorists and told to have some respect. They then retailed this to the group, and that catalysed further outrage. So basically what I thought was interesting and what I'm going to focus on, because I can't possibly describe all the field work, was a particular kind of front of tension. And it wasn't really between devout Catholicism and outright atheism and ex-Catholicism. It was between what we're told is the new default, this kind of laissez-faire cultural Catholicism, and ex-Catholicism. That's where the tension I found that I thought was interesting was. So I compare these to two kind of rival moral ethics about the virtue of remaining in some sense connected to the church. One I describe as the ethic of harmony, the cultural Catholic ethic. So here, belief is really, it's unfixed, flexible, game for speculation. You can believe in certain contexts, but not in others. You can question as much as you like. People who were unbelievers tended to present this to me as a kind of dark personal insight that it wasn't their duty to spread. It shouldn't be allowed to interfere with existing social obligations, basically. So I can kind of call this an ethic of harmony. It's based around kind of smooth relations with the rest of the group, not pissing off older relatives, not causing a problem by not taking part in various important rites of passage and rituals. These kind of things are important considerations. To give you an idea of what that looks like, a particular extreme version of what it looks like, here is some words from an informant. He's describing his beliefs here. He says how, he'd like to think that there's some sort of a release of this energy or electricity from a dead corpse into the oblivion or universe or whatever. And then maybe we're just re-entered like a data bank or thrown back into a star-making machine that turns out all these stars in the centre of the galaxy. But it's unfortunate to believe that we're just food for crows. That's the way it is. It's quite poetic. But then he also identifies as a Catholic and has had his children baptised, and they've gone through the various rites of passage and so on. And when asked about this, he provides this justification. I baptised them because I had to. There would have been a holy war, a jihad, a Catholic jihad. Not by the Catholic priests, mind you, but the woman he was married to at the time. He goes on to say how there's no arguing with these people. It's a tradition and it's expected and has to be respected. And you have no argument against that. So it's very much an idea of cleaving to a kind of minimalized version of Catholicism in order to ensure social harmony. And this can be juxtaposed with what I describe as the ethic of authenticity, which seemed to be something that a lot of ex-Catholics clove to. Okay, and this was kind of, there was an emphasis on authentic belief, and there was a derogation of any kind of action not motivated by this thing, authentic belief, and one must live, in keeping with what one believes, and this is an extremely important thing to do. Cultural Catholicism, which you've kind of seen previously, is often portrayed as a kind of form of bad faith, as a kind of unwoken unbelief, a sort of self-deception, at least as regards the kind of beliefs and stances and moral positions advocated by the Catholic Church. And it's what's in moral psychology described as an individualizing ethic. The kind of individual shouldn't be subordinated to the group. They should be free. Freedom and kind of individual liberty is what is of most importance. To give you another look at this ethic in action, this is an ex-Catholic who we're going to be seeing now. She became extremely annoyed when her sister, who is probably describable as a cultural Catholic, baptised their children, baptised her sister's children. And she was sufficiently exercised by this to write an email and send it to Joe Duffy. So, yesterday my sister baptised her second child. I'm disgusted. I'm sure it was the first time she's been in a church since the baptism of her first child, before that her wedding. I'm sure the real reason is to fit in or to please my older family members, so the same values that are considered important in the cultural Catholic camp are considered vices here. Not that they would have asked her to do it. Maybe it's because she's not sure about what to believe, again a kind of derogation of somebody who isn't convinced. Conviction is important. Maybe she wants to be able to get her kids into a school more easily. The reason is definitely not because she believes, which is what would count as the only legitimate reason, although she would argue that it is to defend her actions. So these two kind of ethics are pitched against one another today in Ireland, I think. And really to understand why, I suppose we should probably look at the exacerbating factor, which I would describe as the cultural Catholic arrangement, where a certain degree of lingering institutional influence, which is obviously, as we see with current referenda, being peeled back very rapidly, permits the retention of identity and in-group solidarity. So, as you know, Catholicism plays an extremely important role in Irish people's sense of who they are and where they come from. It's the means by which society structures the various rites of passage that are important as people move on through the world, as they get confirmed and they get communed and they, get married in churches and die in Catholic funerals. I was at a Catholic funeral quite recently in which one of the mourners came up to the front and placed a box set of Father Ted on the coffin. So, these are just kind of rituals. And then there is also the placation of older relatives who may also be quite religious in a more orthodox sense, and the importance of doing that. In many ways, this is quite a comfortable situation. It's been facilitated to an extent by I suppose, almost an inversion of dominance between the church and society. Most of the religious informants I talked to, and in particular priests, felt that they'd been demoted to the status of kind of service providers for rituals and rites of passage. And they felt as well that the scandals, as they're euphemised, had played a large role in consolidating this situation, because now cultural Catholics were free to engage as much or as little as they wanted with the institution while still availing of various rites of passage. And they could also believe what they want as well. I mean, that's, you see, often you would think that this kind of clerical abuse and paedophilia might make people less willing to affiliate as Catholic. And in many cases, that's probably true. But also, there are sort of paradoxical reactions as well, whereby the kind of tainting and kind of moral collapse of the hierarchy also allows you to decide what Catholicism means for you yourself, and to bat off any kind of incoming criticism of what that is. I mean, a good example of that was given me by a young man called Craig, who identified as Catholic, and also as a believing Catholic. So I asked Craig, well, what do you believe in then? What's God for you, Craig? And he told me that it is a kind of voluntary reincarnation, where your soul leaves your body and then enters another body. And the purpose of this kind of process of reincarnation is that you get to experience life from various different perspectives. And for him, God is this process of reincarnation. And I asked him, it's not exactly consonant with the Catholic Church's view. What do you think they would say about that? And Craig had an extremely swift rejoinder to that. He said, well, they're against everything really, except for molesting little boys. So, in a way, the kind of, it's given cultural Catholicism a lot more autonomy. It's a lot more capable of self-defining what Catholicism is and how much one ought or ought not to be involved with it. But from the kind of more secularist ex-Catholic perspective, there's a cost to this. One is baptism, which is the production of ontological Catholics. Another is what the sociologist Abbey Day calls natal nominalism, which is the production of bureaucratic Catholics. So the census goes out and large numbers of people who may be like Craig nevertheless tick the Catholic box. And then this is used to justify continuing influence in the educational sphere, for example. The Catholic school. And then this has outcomes which are considered unfavourable for many people who have rejected Catholicism to court. As good example as any that I can give you is this image here on the bottom right. This is taken from a textbook, a religious education textbook. I think it's called Grow in Love. And there is a particular page which details the wonderful variety of beliefs and commitments visible around the world, each illustrated with a smiling face. You know, a smiling face with a bindi, for example, for Hinduism, a smiling bearded man for Islam, slightly confused looking but still smiling person for agnosticism. But the atheist, though, the atheist is an angry man who's shouting the word no. So this image was circulated in some of the secularist groups I follow to considerable outrage. So there's a feeling that the kind of maintenance of Catholic influence in the state, propped up by people who don't really believe it, is something that aggravates ex-Catholics and pitches them against what David McWilliams, for example, perceives to be the emerging default, which is a kind of, as he said on the Late Late Show, you know, my friends in Dunleary voted for repeal on Tuesday and then on Wednesday took their daughters off to get them fitted for communion dresses and see no problem with this. You know, it's true. Many people, most people perhaps, are like that in the South, but there is an emerging situation of moral conflict about that, and it's very questionable how long that may last. That completely depends on how long current dynamics go on for. But anyway, what I also found was, because Tuam, I don't know if it's fortuitous to talk about the discovery of 796 infant remains in a septic tank, but for me it was fortuitous because it happened in the middle of my fieldwork. So I got to see what happens when a scandal explodes. And what I saw is it kind of really reinforces this divide between cultural Catholicism and ex-Catholicism, because in this situation then cultural Catholicism begins to look like an act of complicity. So you get the church portrayed as a kind of cardinal evil, this source of harm, of damage. It's sort of talked about with anger and a sense of disgust. Connection to Catholicism is then portrayed as a force of complicity in the church's crimes. And this gets kind of amplified and made especially so if it's not the product of orthodox belief, which might excuse it. The orthodox believer is kind of excused because they're, you know, portrayed as being, oh well, okay, they're supporting the church, but the church did brainwash them, right? You know, whereas the cultural Catholic, who no longer buys into it, but still gives nominal support, is perceived to be a much more conscious and exploitative kind of entity. So it's kind of what you get then in ex-Catholic discourse was this portrayal of a kind of infernal alliance between a kind of lazy or complicit or almost mindless kind of a mob that keep a harm-causing institution in power. To give you some idea of what that looks like, here, for example, is a meme that was, well, it was an attempt to circulate this meme. I think in the end of the day, the meme was a little bit too extreme to really take off, because I don't think people are going to be posting this on their Facebook walls. But what it has is baptism, when you want your baby to be a member of an organised child rape and murder racket. So this is the idea of kind of cultural Catholicism as a form of inexcusable complicity. To continue with the email that I started with, the Joe Duffy email that my informant Emma sent, she goes on to say, I was complaining to a group of friends, and one of them, presumably a cultural Catholic, said, what's the harm? And at this point I'd just like to say that what's the harm is a kind of bête noire of the ex-Catholic informants that I talk to. They when they want to beat up on a particular attitude, they beat up on the what's the harm attitude. Well, let's see, what is the harm? And then she ignores a range of factors here. Ignoring the whole paedophilia, Magdalene laundries, homophobia, sexism, crusades, inquisition, cover-ups and scandals question. There's a very large community who believe the church should have no hand in education, healthcare, politics. So you get this kind of, then this gets leveraged to question the kind of cultural Catholic complicity. Even people I know who are like my sister believe it should be separate. So surely baptizing your child is a vote to keep the reins in the hands of the church. Okay, so just to speak briefly about the moral psychological affordances scandal. So currently, the current view in moral psychology is that moral judgment making is very much influenced by kind of swift emotional intuitions. You can have a sudden feeling of disgust. You can have a sudden feeling of anger. You have a sudden feeling that you're being cheated somehow, or that somebody's done something impure or in some way unpleasant. And that rationalization, moral reasoning, is sort of post hoc and primarily focused towards convincing other people that you're right and swaying them in arguments. And if we are to examine an example of the scandals as employed around Tuam, as employed in ex-Catholic discourse, we see a lot of these kind of emotive appeals are drawn on. Here, for example, dear people of Ireland, what exactly would it take for you to dissociate yourselves from this disgusting organisation which hides dead babies, hides paedophiles, child rapists, and then doesn't even bother to pay in full the redress scheme for survivors, and then has the sheer fucking audacity to lecture us on the value of life. And then she goes on to say how you sell yourselves on your identity for a church wedding, and fake baptise your children for a school place, and have a communion or confirmation for a piss-up. Where were your ashes on Wednesday? When was the last time you were at Mass? Do you even know what transubstantiation means? Never mind, believe it. Our republic can never be free until you free yourself from your group Stockholm syndrome of the Catholic Church. So to look at this from a moral psychological eye, there's this use of disgust, the idea of it as being a kind of like a contaminating association that one wouldn't really want to be in touch with, that would not make one want to kind of withdraw from. There's extensive use of tropes around harm and care, the damage that's done to the young, particularly the most vulnerable. And there's particularly extensive use of arguments based around the idea of fairness and cheating, both that the church itself is a cheater, in that it promised to pay people with this redress scheme and then failed, and then also that the people who continue to involve themselves with the church, despite their lack of real commitment, are also cheating. They're sort of free riding in this way. They're going for the easy option and not standing up for what they should be doing. So those are the kind of moral, psychological affordances of scandal. But these intuitions aren't just present in raw form. Anthropologists also emphasize that kind of new moral and normative stances sort of spread and become popular depending on the extent to which they can be kind of packaged in certain schema and narratives and stories. And they transmit or fail to transmit in a kind of situation of conflict between different groups with different ideas of what is right and wrong, according to how well they meld with particular narratives that catch on or don't. So this particular one fits very well with existing schema around what it means to be Irish that already are in place. The idea of kind of oppression, the idea that liberation from external oppression and a kind of dream of long withheld freedom. These are kind of parts of the script or the schema of being Irish that have been in place for a very long time. And this new moral narrative kind of maps onto those quite well. And so I would argue that it creates a kind of catchy moral narrative around disaffiliation. And it repositions it as a kind of viable alternative to the cultural Catholic default, which then also gets drawn into conscious awareness to a greater degree. To give you an illustration of what that looks like, here is taken from the Facebook profile of one of my informants. Just to clarify, love priest, hate priests is the comment on the t-shirt he's showing here. Priest is the heavy metal band Judas Priest here. He's not expressing fondness for some particular, like Father Smith or something like that, So he loves priest, but he hates priests. And then he gives a kind of like account of why this is. He talks about how we, meaning Irish people, have been colonised by Vikings, Normans and English, but the worst offenders have been the Roman Catholic Church. They beat and raped and killed our children, enslaved and silenced our women, and told us we'd all go to hell for questioning them. Today, which this was the day after the repeal the 8th referendum, the church is hanging on by its fingertips, and we just took a hammer to their hands. The future is ours. So there's this sort of script of liberation from unjust oppression, which explicitly here is linked on to previous notions of Irishness as a struggle against oppression. And I think that's most of what I have. Oh no, I have another one. Yeah. So then I suppose this does raise the question of if we have this very potent and powerful kind of moral narrative emerging around disaffiliation, where now to reject the church is part of a kind of moral stance. What about the believers? How does it go for them? And with my interviews with them, I found that instead of this kind of cohesive story, they're sort of fragmenting to a certain degree. So I tried to produce ideal types just for the sake of simplicity here. So you have the kind of conservative, obedience-focused Catholics. There's often in their talk there would often be a lot of rhetoric about general society at the time being supportive of the kind of abusive institutions that are now used to denigrate the church. There's be a lot of talk of kind of counter-weaponizing talk of victimhood. So they'd say that the church has been a victim of disloyalty, that people have used the scandals as an excuse to defect. They might also kind of saccade towards, if you raise the topic of clerical abuse, they'd talk about how good priests have been victimized by this sort of tainting of the church, and they've seen priests spat on, broken. These are the words that were used. So there's kind of a counter move where the secularist is portrayed as a kind of aggressive manipulator of tragedy, and a kind of multiplier of it by drawing in innocence. And they often, and I think this is a more difficult argument for them to make now, would portray themselves as kind of defenders of a sort of silent faithful against a media elite in Dublin 4. Then there are kind of liberal, harm-focused Catholics. For them, they would often make arguments that the church is bad, but that the laity are the true church, and they would sort of amputate Catholicism, their own little version of it, from the mainstream. Often they sort of clove to a kind of universalistic spirituality and made the case that Catholicism was only their own local interpretation of the general positive good of being spiritual, whatever the word spiritual means. It's often not defined. It's a kind of open signifier. And often they would kind of saccade towards positive extra-institutional, or in the case of Pope Francis, institutional role models. Of course, his name has been more dragged through the muck with respect to these issues than when I was in the field. And then there's the more traditionalists for whom it's a source of community and comfort, and they really can't get away from it. They can't imagine leaving it at all in the first place. Often they back up their involvement with personal stories of divine intervention and Catholic experience. They would frequently emphasize a kind of paedophilic infiltrator theory as well, thereby salvaging the institution as a whole. So I suppose the question is whether this kind of change in moral climate and this emergence of a viable, completely ex-Catholic moral position is going to become common and new, or is it just going to remain a minority pursuit? You see it leveraged in census campaigns. For example, this is an Atheist Ireland census campaign. You can see it's juxtaposing the Irish Republic against the grey, old Catholic country. You can also see, maybe it's some sort of post-Brexit prediction, but it appears to be unified. But so the Catholic country here is sort of Magdalene laundries and child abuse and dogma and baptism for education and mass graves. Whereas the other side, it's all equal citizens in a secular state. It's based on science, equal access to school, and all these kind of things. So here we have the kind of attempt to get people to disaffiliate based on this kind of new moral image of the darkness of the Catholic past. One of my informants, she said that after the 2011 census, she entered herself as Catholic. This is someone who's been unbeliever for a very long time and has always been morally liberal and skeptical of Catholic moral positions, but went on in a kind of inertial way, ticking the Catholic box, census after census after census. But then she talks about waking up from a kind of strange sense of conscription. And now she doesn't tick that box, she ticks a different one. She says how she doesn't want to be a number in favour of agendas she vehemently disagrees with, and she's really not a Catholic. So we'll see going down the line to what degree the new normative stance I've tried to outline today spreads or is contained. in a more kind of default cultural Catholic future situation. So just to conclude, I suppose what we're talking about is the emergence of a new way of being a good, and this time secular, Irish person, juxtaposed against Inglis's long-standing description of how to be a good Catholic meant to have that Catholic habitus, and then it became just having, kind of a tangential arm stretched out towards Catholicism just to keep your oar in with the in-group, the default cultural Catholic position. So, yeah, I'd say the scandals entered a kind of vacuum of an increasingly habitual, tenuous, but institutionally entrenched Catholicism. This gave rise to a new, catchy moral narrative of liberation from a repressive, abusive past that was sort of made urgent by lingering church influence. This kind of draws the existing default, which was almost unconscious before cultural Catholicism, into scrutiny, and it kind of weakens that ethno-religious bond a bit. It allows unbelief and atheism, once stigmatized, to become part of a kind of public moral stance in a way that it wasn't before. I think this is unusual. I mean, I undertook some of this research with funding from a body called Understanding Unbelief that are tried to understanding the varieties of non-religion in different countries. I think it's interesting in that it's as much a rejection of habitual or inertial religion as it is devout religiosity, and in that way it's kind of different from the sorts of committed secularism and atheism that you see in the United States, for example. So I'd say the current Republic of Ireland is sort of defined by a rapid depletion of this embodied religious behaviour, accelerated too by the scandals, and the presence of a very cognitively catchy, moralised, non-religious alternative. And I suppose to conclude, really, the degree to which this comes to displace the cultural Catholic default in the decades going forward really depends, among other factors, on the degree to which the Church continues to appear as a threat to be opposed, a threat to secular values and ambitions, or if it becomes something, as it swiftly seems to be doing with various referenda, and if it got pulled out of education as well. You could see a situation emerging much more like Denmark, for example, where the Catholic Church is a bit like the Danish Lutheran Church. It's just a kind of ritual service provider that nobody really is bothered caring about very much. That remains to be seen. So, thank you.